Okay. So questions we're going to be addressing about snow. There's 3 questions. Number 1, I come home on Friday just before Shabbos. I don't have time to shovel the snow before Shabbos. Can I shovel it on Shabbos? Number 2, my company hires my business hires a company to clear the parking lots from the snow. Do I have to make sure they don't come on Shabbos? And number 3, it's very cold. Sidewalk outside my property is very icy. Am I allowed to put out salt on Shabbos? Now, let's leave aside the 3rd question for a moment, just thinking about the first 2 questions. The question about shoveling the snow and having a company clear my parking lot from the snow. There are a number of differences between those 2 questions, which were sort of intentionally implanted into the way the questions were worded. And I'm wondering what you guys think. What comes to mind when thinking about those 2 questions? What are the relevant differences? Any thoughts?
Safety and emergencies.
Go on, elaborate.
I think that, like with Hatzalah, that certain rules are meant
The issue.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. That's one important difference. What else?
you're not going to actually pay them on that day.
You're not going to pay them on that day. Okay. What else? Anyone? Avram, Pesach, Shneir? Okay, are you going to yourself or ask a guy to do it? Very good. What else?
I paid somebody for the whole winter.
We'll get to that. Okay. There's 2 other differences that come to my mind that are important. One is that if you're just clearing the snow outside your property, usually you'll just be using a hand shovel versus if you're clearing a parking lot, you're going to be using a tractor or some sort of machine. And another difference which could come into play is there a difference between snow that fell before Shabbos versus snow that fell on Shabbos? And that brings us to the first part of the whole discussion is we have to determine, is snow muktzah? Right? You're going to be clearing up snow. And obviously, as we'll see going along, there's obviously going to be big differences between whether you're living in a place with an Eruv or without an Eruv. But the first question that has to be addressed is snow muktzah? Now, l'chayra, the answer should be a very clear no, it's not muktzah. And that is based on the Gemara that says explicitly that rain is not muktzah. Rain is not muktzah, so if rain is not muktzah, then why should snow be muktzah? The reason why rain is not muktzah, the Gemara says something along to the effect of that it was already there yesterday. It was in the clouds already yesterday. It's not a new entity. A new entity is called Noilad. It could be muktzah. And many poskim explicitly write that snow is not muktzah. I'll list a number of them. First of all, we have the Eshel Avram, the B'char Rav. We've spoken about him many times. And he writes in Siman Shin Yud Beis, Nira de Sheleg, Einu muktzah klal b'Shabbos Kodesh. Snow is not muktzah at all. Why? Kiven deroi litni la'ifus b'makom shasiyah ki yodua k'nog litin la'avotz istaf k'sheleg. It's one of its uses is that you could give it to ducks to drink. Apparently, and he says it's known that ducks often drink specifically snow rather than water. And therefore, there's no issue of muktzah at all, even in a place where there aren't ducks commonly available. I think that there's other uses for snow also. You can use it, if necessary, you can even use it to drink yourself or to wash your hands. Okay, people like to use the snow to make a snowball fight or snowman, which is another separate shaila whether it's permissible to do that on Shabbos, which we're not going to get into that today. Other reputable poskim, I actually found on Eitzar Chachma, which is the hard drive I have with lots of svarim, I have a sefer called Hanoisin Shaleg, all about snow and any possible any possible question related to snow. You can find addressed over there. Snow on Hanukkah, snow on Sukkah, snow on Pesach, snow on Shavuos, whatever you want. So he has obviously a whole chapter on Shabbos, and he brings a whole host of poskim who say that it's not muktzah, and notably he quotes Rabbi Yosef as saying that they are not muktzah. Also, Rivavos Ephraim is Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt, who was the prominent Rav and Pesach in Memphis, and Nishmas Shabbos, that's David Harpenos, who's a Pesach in I think he lives in Williamsburg. Ray Moshe, that's the Debretziner Rav, also a prominent contemporary Pesach, and a number of others. And of course, from the Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, it's quoted in Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa that snow is not muktzah. The exception to all of this is a rather cryptic and curious tshuva from Ramosha, where Ramosha finds that says that snow is muktzah, and he doesn't really explain why, and he says they have a noilot because it's a new entity, and he says it's not the fact that it says explicitly that rain is not muktzah. Ramosha says that's not a contradiction, but he doesn't explain why. Okay, so a number of things have been suggested. I'm not really expert. I don't know if anybody around this table is in the formation of rain and snow, and does snow form and come quicker than the rain? I don't know exactly. And in fact, in this Sefer HaNosin Shelek, he quotes that in Ramosha Gufa there's a contradiction. He says that in a certain Sefer, which I wasn't able to find, he quotes Ramosha saying explicitly that snow is not muktzah. Be that as it may, even if Moshe did mean it, it's rather cryptic and difficult to understand, and certainly a whole host of prominent poskim who explicitly say snow is not muktzah. So therefore, that would appear not to be a problem. Now, Rabbi, now here, by the way, even according to Ramosha, l'chayra, snow would only be muktzah. He says that the reason it's muktzah is because it's noilad. Noilad means if a new entity comes into being on Shabbos, then you're not allowed to use it, right? So in certain instances, if honey comes out of it flows from the beehive, that could be a problem. There's all sorts of examples of this, but that would not apply. Moshe doesn't. Again, it's a half a line, but Moshe, that would not apply to snow that fell before Shabbos. Right, so therefore, in the first shaila, where I said the guy comes home, if he still does it, there used to definitely be this sort of daily halacha. He has very interesting sources. And he says something which l'chayra is obvious, but I didn't see anybody else saying it. There is a halacha. Let me see if I posted this in the English. That's just a second. No, I didn't post this in English. But there is a halacha in Shulchan Aruch, and I'll read it to you from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch in Siman Shin Lamed Ches, chapter 338, Sif Tes, number 9. Mutalit klit halachas hadelef b'Shabbos. Now, basically, there is a halacha. Part of the rules of muktzah are now you're not allowed to take something, a utensil, and make it unusable, make it forbidden to use on Shabbos. So, for example, if you have a candle burning, the fuel of that candle is muktzah. Now, let's say you have your candle with your paraffin or your oil, and there's a leak, right? So you're not allowed to take a cup and put it under to catch that oil, because then you're going to be making that cup muktzah, right? So then, so that's an introduction to this halacha. So the Alter Rebbe says over there, "Mutar nitin kli tachas hadelef b'Shabbos." You have a delef. Delef means the rain dripping from the gutter, let's say, right? So you're allowed to put the rain. A utensil under this raindrop on Shabbos. And if the bucket gets filled up, like we had here in the kitchen last week, you empty it out and put your utensil back. Says the Alter Rebbe, that's only if the rain dripping into it is clean enough at least to be used for washing, right? Which is, again, I think that was the case here last Shabbos, so no regrets. If the delef is filthy that you can't use it, never mind for drinking, but even for washing yourself, then it's muktzah. But also, you're not allowed to move. You're not allowed to move the delef, the raindrops. Therefore, also you would also not be allowed to put a utensil under it, because that would be sort of disqualifying this utensil from being used. So that's what it says in Shulchan Aruch. So Rabbi Broin adds over here that that we're assuming that snow is not muktzah is only if it's clean snow. If you have snow that's, I don't know, been driven over by cars and the filthy snow that you would never use, and you wouldn't even let your kids have a snowball fight with them, right? So then l'chayra, everybody would agree that snow is muktzah. Again, that's usually not relevant to the snow in your sidewalk. And yeah,
Yellow snow.
That's what it's called.
Yellow snow, yeah.
Would the duck not eat it?
With a dog.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I can't imagine the ducks would eat the filthy snow from the car. Yeah. So there, again, it's not usually relevant to the snow that you need to shovel from your sidewalk or from your walkway. But okay, so that's the first inyan. Now the other two inyanim which have to be covered initially are, for the first question, is number one, tiltul b'rshus harabim, carrying in the street, right? Because you're going to be carrying the snow from the sidewalk to wherever you're putting it. And the other one is more generic and less specific, more difficult to sort of have a clear-cut answer to, is things related to tircha, to extra work, to zilzal Shabbos. It may not be forbidden, but it's after milsa, it's disrespectful to the Shabbos. It's not Shabbosdik. So that's another question that has to be addressed. And of course, assuming that we're not using tractors and plow machines, that's touching on the second question. But for the first question, I come home before Shabbos and I don't have time to shovel the snow, so there's certainly no issue of muktzah. What about carrying in the Reshus Harabim? And now, so in the very prominent Sefer Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa, he brings as follows. He says, at a leisa tzorich, when necessary, mutar lefanis shalik min harachav, it's permissible to clean snow from the street. When your intention is to avoid pedestrian slipping, provided it's not a Reshus Harabim Gemura. Now, what that means is we talk about the public domain and the private domain. Private domain is in your house; there you're allowed to carry. Public domain is the street; you're not allowed to carry. Now, again, ignoring the possibility of an eruv. Now, the truth is that there's a Reshus Harabim Gemura, a public domain where it's actually forbidden to carry on a biblical level, is only a street where, only a street or a city where you have 600,000 people going through. But if it's less than that, so then it's called a Carmelist, which means it's only rabbinically a public domain, and then we could be much more lenient. And by the way, the most common application of this question is an eruv. An eruv can only be built in a place which is a Carmelist, a place which is a Reshus Harabim, right, a public domain. An eruv doesn't help. So I'm sure you've all heard a different eruv in different cities become very controversial, and often the controversy is surrounded about this: what to determine whether this specific neighborhood or this specific city is a Reshus Harabim. Just as an example, how do you count 600,000 people? Which streets affect other streets? Does it have to be 600,000 people every day or once in a while? It is a very, very complicated, complex discussion. Just as an example, in my hometown in London, so there's Northwest London, which is basically Golders Green and Hendon combined. Golders Green and Hendon is like West Rogers Park is to Skokie. It's two neighboring, or maybe even West Rogers Park to Lincolnwood and Peterson Park. But in between Golders Green and Hendon, so that eruv was, when it initially was very controversial, and I think till today, there's politics and issues with it. But one of the issues is that there's a street, a big sort of basically a highway that cuts between those two neighborhoods of Golders Green and Hendon. And it's people walk across all the time. There's a bridge that crosses over. It's like it's considered like one neighborhood, but there is that highway that goes in between. And I think that, again, I'm not the base expert here, but I think that if there would be two separate Erevin, one for Golders Green and one for Hendon, skipping on the highway, that would solve a lot of the issues over there. Anyway, back to our case, as he's saying, so as long as you're not in a Rosh Hashanah Gemura, you're in what's called a Carmelis, so then we don't have a problem with you clearing off the snow. And also, the street has to be paved, because if it's not paved and it's loose earth, again, this is highly unusual that the area that you're in a rush to shovel should be an unpaved area. But if it's unpaved, then there's other issues of flattening out the earth. So he says it's permissible to do it. He says, nevertheless, you should have a guy do it for you. And if a guy is doing it for you, and if you have a guy doing it for you, you can do it even in a absolute Rishus Harabim. If you're doing it yourself, you can only do it in the Carmelis, in a quasi Rishus Harabim. If you have a guy doing it for you, then you can do it in a complete Rishus Harabim.
If you own a business.
Hold on 1 second. Hold on. Okay, just one moment. One of the primary Tshuvas sources that he quotes over here is the Mishnah Halachos of Menashe Klein, who has a whole Tshuva on this. And what I want to do with the rest of the time we have today is to go through the various points that Rabbi Menashe Klein makes and see how he builds his argument to allow it. And then I anticipate that the other two questions we'll probably address next week. Yes, Don.
Oh, if you own a business, can you have a boy work for you on Shabbos?
Wow, that's a loaded question.
Oh, I thought it would be a simple answer or no, yes or no.
No. Okay, so actually, and so the first thing we need to, those laws are extremely complex. There's actually at least one book in the library, an English book, entirely on that subject. But let's get a very brief overview of this topic from, if you look on your source sheet, the very beginning where it says section 244, which labors may be performed by a non-Jew for the sake of a Jew. Okay. It is forbidden for a Jew to allow a non-Jew to perform forbidden labor for him on Shabbos. So for right now, we're discussing only having the non-Jew do forbidden labor for you. We're not talking about having him, right. If you have a goy, how can you set the table for me? Setting the table is permissible activity, so there's no reason not to ask a goy to do it. But if there's something which is forbidden to do on Shabbos, you're not allowed to have a goy do it for you. This applies even if the non-Jew is working primarily for his own wages, but he's hired as a day worker. E.g., the Jew hired him before Shabbos and told him, for every day that you will work for me, I will give you this and this sum. Although the Jewish employee did not explicitly tell him to work on Shabbos as well, but rather he performed the labor on Shabbos on his own initiative, the Jewish employer must admonish him, as explained in section 243.4. Right now, when it comes to having non-Jews plow your snow for you, or let's say clear your snow in front of your sidewalk, there's basically three ways that it's commonly done. One way, which I don't think is so common here in Chicago, but maybe in Brooklyn and in other neighborhoods, this is very common, is you don't have any contract with anybody. If it snows, you have the guys going up and down in the street, you hail them down and say, okay, $10, $20, clear my walkway. That's explicit. I'm asking him to do something for me right here, right now. Then another option is that you have a contract. Now the contracts, again, there could be many variables, but basically there's two types of contracts. One contract is that I pay a guy and I have a contract with him and I say, for every time you clear the snow, you're going to get $50. And then you don't have to call him every time. Every time it snows, he comes and he sends you a bill. Another way to do it is that you say to the guy, I'm going to pay you X amount of money a month. And every time, if it never snows, you keep the money. If it snows every day, you have to come every day, right? Those are basically the various forms of contracts that usually exist for this. So here he's saying that if you tell the guy explicitly, every time you do this for me, I'm going to pay you. That's called a schir yoim. And that's forbidden on Shabbos. If, however, the non-Jew acts as a contractor, a kablan in halachic terminology, i.e., he agrees to perform a specific task with a specific fee, it is permitted to allow him to perform his entire task on Shabbos. So here we're talking, for example, about, I tell him, look, I want you to make me a suit, right? And I'm going to pay you $500 to make me a custom-made suit. I don't care if you make the suit on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or Shabbos. I just want it to be ready on time for my wedding, right? So in that case, a license is granted whether the non-Jew works with his own materials or even if he acts with materials provided to him by the Jewish employer to perform the task. E.g., he gave him a garment to sew and set a fee for sewing the garment, or provided him with strands of fabric to weave the garment. Everything okay? Yes. In the latter instance, license is granted for the non-Jew to perform the entire task on Shabbos, whether he agreed to weave the entire garment and set a fee for performing the task, or whether he never agreed to weave the entire garment and the employer set a fee for every cubit that he will weave. These terms of employment differ from hiring a day worker, which is prohibited because the work of a day worker that a day worker performs does not belong to him. It is not his concern when working. He does not have the intent to complete the task. For the completion of the task is not his responsibility, and he derives no benefit from its completion. Instead, his intent is to work for the Jewish employer throughout the entire day so that he will be paid his day's wage. Therefore, he is considered to be acting as the Jew's agent. With regard to a contractor, by contrast, the work is his. His intent when working is to complete the task that he will receive his fee. Thus, he is not considered as the Jew's agent. Okay, so as we alluded to already before, the specifics of every case can get very complex, but the basic overview is very simple. If I hire the guy to do a job for me, I want you to make me a custom-made suit. So when he works on Shabbos, he's not working on Shabbos for me. He's working on Shabbos for himself. He wants in theory, we're going to see now the exceptions, but in theory, now, what's the big exception? When is license given to allow a non-Jewish contractor to perform a task on Shabbos? When he performs a task with an entity that is not attached to the ground, so that the non-Jew could perform it in his own home or in another place that is not the domain of the Jew. Thus, it would not be evident that the task belonged to the Jew, and there's no question of the impression that would be created. So in addition to whether or not it's strictly speaking, if the non-Jew is considered my agent or not, there's the other question is, what is everybody going to think? Which could be divided into either chashad or maras ayin, but basically it's the question of what are other people going to think about what I'm doing. So if it's something like a suit, which he goes into his workshop and he makes me a suit, that's fine. But if he's going to be cutting my grass, it doesn't make a difference if he's a kabbalah or not. If I tell him, look, I'm paying you $500 for the next 6 months for you to maintain my front lawn, or back, or whatever, yeah, it doesn't make a difference. The fact that he still can't come to my property because then people might think that I hired him on Shabbos, right? That's actually quite relevant here. You know, you have the guys, you pay them to come once a month. If they come on Shabbos, and even more, usually they might not come on Saturday, but they come on Yom Tov. Yeah, if Yom Tov's on a Tuesday, so it's your responsibility to make sure they don't come.
Even in Chol Moed, you can't.
Correct, even in Chol Moed. Different laws apply, however, when the non-Jew is working with something that is connected to the ground, e.g. he was contracted to build a house for a Jew or harvest the fields for a Jew. In these instances, since it is apparent and commonly known that the property belongs to the Jewish employer, it is evident to any observer that the task is also being performed for his sake. Therefore, if the property is in the middle of a town or within the town's Shabbos limits, the Tchum Shabbos, the Jewish employer is forbidden to allow the non-Jew to perform the task on Shabbos because of the impression that it would create. For the observer would say that the non-Jew is a day worker hired by the Jewish employer. Okay, so by the way, some like this Jewish trivia. what's something that's permissible on Shabbos but forbidden on Chol HaMoed? The answer is to have, in certain instances, to have a goy do work for you outside of the tchum, outside of the Jewish area. On Shabbos, it's permissible because as long as you've set it up in the way of the contract that's permissible, there's no concern of what other people are going to think because it's outside of the community. But on Chol HaMoed, where people might travel there, because it's permissible to travel on Chol HaMoed, it would be forbidden because you're not allowed to have contractors do work for you on Chol HaMoed. And yeah, anyway, that's just by the way. Okay, so in this case, if we were to argue that removing snow on Shabbos is forbidden, either because it's a shusarabim and you're going to move it more than 4 cubits in the public domain, or if the guy is coming with a tractor or something else which makes it absolutely forbidden on an activity that's forbidden on Shabbos. So here it would appear from here that it would be forbidden on Shabbos because even if you have your contract set up in a way that you're paying him a certain amount per month or per winter, whatever it is, and he comes every time there's snow, the fact is it's on your property, it's right in front of your house, and everybody knows that when he's plowing the snow or shoveling the snow in front of your house, that you're the one who hired him. So that would appear to be forbidden. But now here we come to a caveat, and as you can see, I skipped to number 8 of the very same chapter. It says like this: in some places, communities are accustomed, this is based on the Magen Avraham, in some places, communities are accustomed to follow a lenient approach and hire non-Jews on a contractual basis to remove garbage from the streets. The non-Jews work for their own benefit. Although the non-Jews work even on Shabbos, these communities are not concerned about the impression that may be created. There are authorities who offer some justification for such a conduct. Okay, so we're talking about some community where, let's talk in modern day phenomena. You might have, let's say, a housing complex, a gated community where the community get together. It's not necessarily, the work is not necessarily done by the city. You have the community getting together, paying assessment fees, and everybody chips in. So they hire a company to remove the garbage. So the Magen Avraham is telling us that there were communities who allowed them to come and take the garbage on Shabbos. So what could be how could this be allowed, right? So the Magen Avraham says, that again, this is the Alter Rebbe quoting, there are authorities who offer some justification for such conduct. Actually, here's the Alter Rebbe differing from the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham suggests a different justification, but the Alter Rebbe says as follows: it has already become a matter of public knowledge that it is common to hire a non-Jew as a contractor to remove garbage and not for him to work as a day worker. Accordingly, there's no need to be concerned about the impression that may be created, as stated in 243.10, with regard to workers hired as contractors for bathhouses, oven and mills. Consult that source. Okay, so basically, the heter that he's saying is because everybody knows that the garbage collectors are done in a contractor, so even are done in a method of a contractor and not as a day worker. So there's no problem of Marasayan of Chashash. The whole problem was, look, if he's going to be mowing your lawn on Shabbos, people might think you hired him this morning. But if everybody knows that standard practice is to hire a contractor to do it, in which case he's not really considered your agent because he's doing it because he wants to get the job done. So then it could be permissible. And the Magen Avraham is not saying explicitly that this heter would apply so clear cut to removing garbage. He just says that there are communities who are accustomed to doing this, and the lashon of the Magen Avraham, if I recall correctly, is something along the lines of that they must have had a reliable Rav who paskin that it's permissible for them, and therefore Magen Avraham is a little bit ambivalent, but he says, okay, we'll leave it as it is. Now, of course, we could suggest that perhaps the same thing would apply to snow, and here also it kind of depends on the community, but I think that, in places like Brooklyn, I think it's more common that people just walk up and down the street and people flag them down and say, hey, would you do my driveway for whatever, $20? And versus a place like Chicago, where it is more common that people have landscapers who they pay a fixed fee for to take care of their property, including clearing the snow whenever it snows. Anyway, be that as it may, in this tshuva that we started talking about from Reb Menashe Klein, he starts. So the person asked him a question. He's addressing, I forget the guy's name. He was a rav in the Bronx, and he says, Kibalti, about the Shaila, is it permissible to clear the snow on the sidewalk? He writes in either sidewalk. Through a guy who you've hired but kablanos, like with a contractor, so he's not a day worker. And this rabbi who wrote the question to the Rabbi Nasha Klein, he said, look, we find the Magen Avraham allowing you to, or at least, and so allowing to remove the garbage on Shabbos. And he says removing the garbage on Shabbos is Issa D'Oraisa. Why is removing the garbage on Shabbos Issa D'Oraisa? So he says because there's a Mishnah that says, and it's brought to Halacha, that if you have some sort of lump in the street and you remove it, that violates a biblical prohibition, because of, if I recall correctly, it's Ashra Gummis. It's related to plowing, because you're smoothing out the ground underneath it. So he says, in that case, again, this person is assuming that garbage is the same. So he says removing garbage would be an Issa D'Oraisa, and nevertheless, the Gadol Echad Ha'olam, he says it's allowed. Why? Okay, so he quotes that whole Magen Avraham that we just saw now to Rabbi about removing the garbage, and therefore he says, look, over here it's really important to remove the snow, and therefore we should be able to apply that lenient ruling of the Magen Avraham with regard to garbage to allow a contractor to remove the snow. Now, why is it important to remove the snow? He doesn't say over here, but there could be two approaches to why it's important to remove the snow. One approach is because it's dangerous; people could slip and fall. Which I haven't researched the statistics, but I don't think that snow is so dangerous. I don't think there's a high chance of people slipping and falling in the snow. The ice could be very dangerous, which is the third question on the list, which we're going to get to next week. But snow in and of itself, l'chayra is not so dangerous, unless you say, well, if you don't clear it, it's going to become icy and it will be dangerous after Shabbos. But if that's the problem, again, then it becomes more, it becomes less of a direct issue relevant right now to Shabbos. The other issue is if it's legally mandated that you clear your sidewalk, and if you could get fined for not doing it, which again is a very locale-based reality. Here in Chicago, I mean, I wish people would get fined because nobody's shoveling their sidewalks, but I imagine there are cities where they're more strict about it. And by the way, there are also cities, certainly I know in Montreal it's like this, and I think in some parts of Skokie it's like this, right here, that the city come and shovel and with like a very narrow tractor and they plow the sidewalk. So every place is very different. Okay, so Rabbi Nasha Klein says to him like this. First of all, if I'm to accept your analysis that there is a biblical prohibition, to remove the snow, because it's like so he says then it would be forbidden, because just because you're going to get fined, nobody's actually going to die from slipping in the snow, and just because you're going to get fined by the government, that's not permission to do something that could be Asa D'Oraisa. Or even it's not mamish going to be Asa D'Oraisa because he's not going to do it himself. He's going to ask a guy to do it. But nevertheless, he's not going to take it. But Menashe Klein says, actually, even if you want to say that taking out garbage is Issa D'Oraisa, again, in the olden day streets, not he says snow is not like that, because snow, and he brings various proofs from this from Mishnayos and different places, that because snow eventually will melt on its own, so it's not even though it might take weeks for that to happen, it's not the same as this case of gafshushis, and therefore there's no biblical prohibition to removing the snow. So once there's no biblical prohibition, now we have to see, is there a rabbinic prohibition? So we've already established that it's not muktzah, and in most cases it's not going to be muktzah, and there's no biblical prohibition. So he says, okay, well let's see. He says, first of all, you could do it biyadav e begufay. You could theoretically remove the snow, pick up the snow with your hands, and move it over. And he says you don't have to move it. Again, he's talking here even in Rosh Hashanah Gemara. We mentioned before that you have a Rosh Hashanah, which is actually biblically considered a public domain or a Carmelis. Even if you're in a Rosh Hashanah Gemara, you're on the highway, you could still move it less than 4 cubits. If you move something less than 6 feet, that's not a problem. You don't, if you're sidewalking, how much, you just need to make a little, so you can just move it up and move it over a few inches in either direction, and that's not a problem. And he says, even if you do move it further than Daled Amos, which is 6 feet, he says, you're only going to have a biblical prohibition if you actually lift it up. But often he says what people do with the snow. By the way, when he says here about doing it with your hands, I'm not sure if he means with your hands as opposed to a shovel, because again, if you have a tractor or a snow blower or something that's electric or gas operated, then that could be more problematic. But as long as you're doing it mechanically, whether it's with your hands or with a shovel, again, you have the issue of where's the shovel coming from and carrying the shovel in the public domain. But theoretically, if you leave a shovel out on your front lawn, well, then you would have to.
You have to keep moving it.
You have to keep moving it. So eventually, you would have more than 4 amas. Okay, so let's not talk about the shovel yet. You're going to lift up the snow with your hands or with your feet. You're going to kick the snow. You're going to sort of kick around the snow in either direction just to clear a little bit of a pathway. He said, and then he says, even if you are going to move it more than 6 feet, you're usually not going to be lifting it up, moving it 6 feet and putting it down. You're just going to be pushing it or dragging it along the floor. And therefore, he says, and additionally, he adds it's a malacha shenetzricha legufa, which means that if you're doing a malacha, but you sort of need the side effect of the malacha, not the actual malacha. So in this case, that would mean the malacha is hitzah. The malacha is carrying in the public domain. So the normal way of carrying in public domain is I'm carrying this because I need this, right? Now. So let's say I need the orange juice. I want the orange juice over there. So I'm going to carry over there. Now, the side effect of that is that the orange juice is no longer here. Now, what if the only reason I'm moving it is because I don't want the orange juice here? So then that would be called the malacha shenetzricha legufa, which according to most opinions downgrades whatever it is from a biblical to a rabbinic prohibition. So even if you are going to lift it up and put it down, you're not going to drag it, and you're going to move it more than 6 feet. He says that's a malacha shenetzricha legufa because you don't want the snow over there. You just don't want it here.
If you're trying to build a snowman, it'll be malacha shenetzricha.
Exactly. And therefore, he says there's no biblical prohibition, and therefore he says once you're telling, and so not only there's no biblical prohibition, there's not even a rabbinic prohibition. In other words, there are ways to do it in a permissible way by just doing it with your hands and moving it less than 6 feet and not picking it off the ground and all these things. And therefore he says even if the guy is going to do it, he's going to bring his own shovel on his car and he's going to carry and do all these things, that's his business. I could tell him, in other words, by me asking him to clear my snow, I'm not asking him to do anything that's forbidden to him to do. I'm just like I could ask a guy to set the table for me. I could ask a guy to remove the snow. Now, if he chooses to bring a shovel instead of doing it with his hands and feet, okay, that's his problem.
He's making it easier for himself.
Right, he's making it easy for himself. Again, just like we had this difference between the day worker versus the contractor. And what was the difference? He says the day worker is working for you, the contractor is working for himself. Well, here, he might be a day worker to move the snow for me, but the fact that he's bringing his plow or his shovel, that's for himself. Okay? Now, here, and again, we're going to get more into this next week because that's why, I split the first two questions. The first question was, I'm coming home, can I clear my snow? The second question is, can I have the guy clear my parking lot? Now, one of the differences between the sidewalk and the parking lot is that the sidewalk, it's certainly very reasonable to do it without any electric machines, without a snowblower, a tractor, or anything like that. A parking lot is not so, right? So it really depends, if you live in a suburban place where your property is very big and it's not a reasonable expectation that it's possible to do by hand, then this argument would carry less weight versus a place like we live here in this neighborhood where it's just your sidewalk, and here's the big thing, there's an Eruv here. So here I'm not even concerned with him, even if you don't use the Eruv, there's no issue with asking a guy to use the Eruv for you, as long as it's a reliable Eruv, which locally it is, right? So I don't even have a problem with, so once there's an Eruv, there's certainly no problem, and you could do it. Now, again, we still have to cut, we said we're going to get to the issue of tircha, or whether it's disrespectful to Shabbos, but at least in terms of malacha, in terms of actual forbidden activity, there's no issue at all. So therefore, based on this, locally here in West Rogers Park, it certainly would not be a problem.
The only issue we're concerned about is carrying.
What else?
Not sure who knows. I don't know.
So we covered that before. That again, in the vast majority of cases, the area that you want to have shoveled is going to be a paved sidewalk.
It's paved. So
You don't have
Okay, so now
to dig all
you're like, okay. And what is doing with your hands solve? Why is that better?
huh?
What is it about the hands thing? Doing with your own hands?
Because then you don't need to carry the shovel. Again, we're talking about without
the
the
shovel. That's the concern. The shovel.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so he continues like this. He says, okay. So far we kind of have a heter, but our heter is very limited. We're talking, okay, so in a place where there's an Eruv, or at least where it's theoretically possible for him to do it without any forbidden. .308, chapter 308, number 49. You see that? So the Alter Rebbe says like this. Let's put it up on the screen. There we go. When a thorn, sorry, when a thorn is found in the public domain, it is permitted to move it less than 4 amos at a time until one removes the thorn to the side of the public domain. Right now, usually, again, we said you're allowed to move something in a public domain less than 4 amos, less than 6 feet. Now, Midiraisa, you could move it 5 feet, put it down, then pick it up again, move it another 5 feet. Usually, we don't allow to do that. But if it's a kite, if it's a thorn which could hurt somebody, so then that would be permissible to do it sort of 5 feet at a time. That's in an actual public domain, or Rosh Hashanah. What if it's a karmelis, which on a biblical level it's permissible to carry, and it's only on a rabbinic level that we treat it like a public domain? So then you don't even need to move it less. You don't even need to do the installments. Then you're allowed to may move the thorn according to his ordinary manner of conduct, i.e. even picking it up just once and moving it a longer distance. These leniencies are granted because there's reasonable concern that people at large could be injured by a thorn. For the sages did not establish a prohibitive decree, a shvus, about carrying a karmelis in instances where it's possible that the public may be injured. Now, the question becomes, okay, so a thorn could damage people and therefore we allow you to move it. Let's assume for argument's sake, the poskim in general, most poskim accept this argument, that nowadays we pretty much consider all areas where we live to be a karmelis. We don't consider places to be a Rosh Hashanah. So in a karmelis, so in other words, even if you don't use the eruv, we're still going to consider the karmelis. So if you see a kite, you see a thorn on the street which could hurt somebody, you're allowed to pick it up and move it to a place where it's no longer going to hurt somebody, even though it's obviously muktzah and you're moving it more than 4 amos. It's permissible because somebody could get hurt on the thorn. Now, the question is, the question which the pasuk discussed over here is, well, what is it? Is anything that could hurt somebody to be compared to a thorn? So if you look down over here in footnote 239 from the English Shulchan Aruch, he says the Magen Avraham cites the Ravash, which states that our sages use the example of thorn because the thorn is not easily visible, and passerby might snap on it without realizing. Similar concepts apply with regard to broken glass or other sharp objects. By contrast, the source of danger that is obvious may not be moved. That's the Ravash's opinion. The Magen Avraham is not in total agreement with this decision. So, okay, so this becomes the question. The question which the National Halachas is now busy in trying to figure out is, well, can we compare the damage that may be inflicted by snow to a thorn? Now, on the one hand, if you accept the Rivash, well, if you don't accept the Rivash, We're assuming here that the person could fall and get hurt on snow. Certainly, if there's ice underneath and whatever it is, right? Now, so if you don't accept the stringency of the Ravash and you hold that anything that somebody could get hurt on, you're allowed to move, so then certainly it's allowed. But there may even be room to be more lenient than that, because even the Ravash, what's his argument? Why does he say that if everybody could see it?
They can walk around it.
Because they can walk around, right? So if you have a thorn, nobody's going to see it. If you have, I don't know, a big rock, right? Well, they don't need to move the rock. Everybody can walk around it. With snow, even though everybody could see it, there's nowhere to walk around. So it could be that even the Ravash would agree that we could be lenient with regards to snow.
Especially if there's ice underneath this.
Right. Yeah, if there's ice underneath the snow, then you have to shovel it and put salt, which was the third question about putting salt on Shabbos, which, spoiler alert, the answer is basically yes. We'll discuss a little bit more detail about it next week, right? So let's say there's ice underneath it, you want to shovel the snow, remove the salt. That could be a very important thing to do. It sometimes frustrates me that, everyone's being so frum and not shoveling the snow and putting out salt on Shabbos, but I don't think it's anything to do with being frum, because they don't do it on Thursday either. So right now, there's a little bit of a counter argument to this, because you could say that because there's nowhere to walk around the snow, so people know to be more careful, versus a thorn, nobody's going to know to be careful. So that is a bit of a question. By the way, another very important area where this is relevant, which we've discussed this in the past, the various shilas that come up with owning pets. Specifically dogs, many shilas with regards to dogs. One of the big shilas is cleaning up from the dog if you're taking your dog for a walk on Shabbos. Again, even if you use the Erev, so there's no issue of carrying, but it's certainly shilas of muktzah. There could be workarounds. You could do it kalachayad. There's ways to do it, but I believe that I believe that there is a heter. I don't know. Again, I can't tell you a name of a rav who paskins this way, but at least in theory, there could be a heter to say that the waist of the dog on the sidewalk is like that of a thorn, because somebody could, again, it's unlikely that somebody could get hurt by it, but it depends. Again, it depends how is the damage here, right? Is the damage a kite? Somebody could get hurt, especially. I assume that the issue with the kites is that it was probably more common for people to walk around without robust shoes like we have nowadays. Nobody's getting hurt on dog waste. There could be inconvenience. There could be maybe financial damage if you have to pay to get your shoes clean. I don't know. Maybe trauma. but another important caveat with that is that usually, if the dog's well trained, he's not going to do it in the middle of the sidewalk. He's going to go next to the side by the fence or next to a tree on the thing, right? So in that case, it's not really a place where people are walking. So what would be the heter to clear up after Shabbos? Well, the fact that
illegal to just leave it.
It's illegal, but the fact that it's illegal doesn't allow you to desecrate Shabbos.
I know, but you'll get punished.
Okay.
You'll get fined.
Okay, so sometimes you have to pay to keep Shabbos.
You can receive a ticket on Shabbos.
No, I'm just saying
Chazal came up with the idea that even something that's muktzah is allowed to be removed on Shabbos when we're talking about waste, because it's considered to be so distasteful to have it around.
Oh, so you want to invoke, right? So you want to invoke the concept of graf shel rei. The problem, graf shel rei means that if you have something that makes it uncomfortable to be around, disgusting to be around, so then there's a special allowance to remove it on Shabbos. The problem with that is, and I don't want to get too sidetracked because this is not about pets on Shabbos, but there's two problems with that. Number one is that there's a prohibition to make a graf shel rei, so you wouldn't be allowed to take your dog out to poop on the street. You would have to make it. Again, I don't know exactly how dogs work, but I assume there's an option for it to do it in the house or in your backyard or something.
No, they don't. They have to poop on the street.
Well, what would happen if they did it in the backyard?
They'll poop in the house. Is where they're
okay, so then they'll poop in the house. But to take the dog out to do it in the street, then.
But if it's in the house, you're also going to have to remove it, right?
Okay. The bigger problem is that it's very questionable whether the street counts as a graf shel rei. If you look in the halachas of graf shel rei, the halacha is that you're in your house. I want to relax on Shabbos afternoon, and but on the street, so don't stand, move up 2 feet. Like nobody's asking you to stand right there where it's going to bother you.
Right, but what I'm saying is it's not going to bother the owner. It's just that there's a realization.
Graf Sharei doesn't seem, again, if you look in the sources, Graf Sharei doesn't seem to be a heter for something that's going to disturb you momentarily as you walk past it. Graf Sharei is a heter for something that's disturbing your comfort while you're sitting in your home.
Yeah.
The bottom line is there doesn't seem to be any very clear-cut heter for clearing up from your dog on Shabbos. And I know somebody here in the community who's a member of one of the Shulchan Tui, and he actually does own a dog now, but initially that was one of the main reasons why he didn't want to get a dog, was because of this shaila. And eventually his wife somehow convinced him. Anyway.
That goes well beyond the dog being mixed up, right? That's another shaila.
Yes.
This is zikr mixed up.
Yes. Anyway, there's some questions where people ask me, I tell them to ask somebody else because they don't want to know what I have to say. So yes. All right.
But you really shouldn't have a dog in the first place.
Okay. Anyway, the bottom line is that he wants to say, based on again he quotes a number of different sources. He brings from Rishonim that even snow, that anything that could hurt you, even if it is possible, even if people can't see it and whatever it is, it should be allowed. It would fall under this category of kites of the thorn in the Rishus Rabbim, and therefore it's mutter. He finishes off saying again, like, I'm not really convinced how dangerous snow is. Obviously, there could be fines involved, but in terms of people's safety, he's not really sure how big of a deal it is. But as he says, anyway, his bottom line is he's not really so comfortable with you doing it on Shabbos. If you don't absolutely have to, but if it's a Carmelis, then it's fine to you to do it on Shabbos, but it's better to do it through a goy because it's not so respectful for Shabbos. And this I alluded to before, that the questions of Uvdin Dechol, of Tircha, of Shemilsa, all these questions of things which, let's just summarize them as saying they're not Shabbostic. When it comes to those things, it's much more difficult to define them exactly. And but certainly the Pasuk will say, better have a goy do it. And as we saw, this is paraphrased in Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasa, where he says it's permissible to clear the snow on Shabbos if you're concerned that people will get hurt. He doesn't, again, if there's, let's just say this theoretically, if there's absolutely no concern that anybody's going to get hurt, and your only reason to do it is because you're scared of getting fined, so then you would have to actually make sure that there's that either there's an eruv or that there's some sort of robust heter. If you're relying on any way of carrying in a Carmelis or anything like that, then there has to be some sort of legitimate concern that people are going to get hurt, and therefore, and then he says it's permissible, and he says if you have a goy do it, you could do it even in a Rishus Rabbim Gemara. Now, what I want to finish off with again, so we've addressed question number 1, questions number 2 and 3. Question number 1 is, yes, you can clear your snow, certainly if there's an eruv. If there's no eruv, you can have a goy do it for you. Assuming that you live in a Carmelis, which is basically the case for most people, and if it's done in the way of a contractor, if you have it wouldn't necessarily be a heter to ask a guy on Shabbos morning to do it, but if you have a contractor who takes care of it, then that would be permissible. I want to finish off, and then the other questions about having them come with machines to plow your parking lot and putting out salt, Ibn Hashem will address more next week. I want to finish off with Chabad source, which is very relevant and also completely irrelevant, as as you'll see in a moment. Just a second. Okay, if you look in the other page that I made here where it says chapter 14, this is from the Kuti Deburim, from the Frierdiker Rebbe's Sichos. And he says, let's first read the story. The year is 5547, 1786. Winter set in with a vengeance, and Liozna, which is where the Alter Rebbe lived at the time, had its first snowfall during Chol Hamoed Sukkos. It was bitterly cold, and to be able to sit in the sukkah, people had to put on fur coats and padded boots. Besides some of the meals that could not start until the snow had been cleared off the roof. That year, Shmini Atzeres fell on Shabbos. Snow fell all Friday night, and in the morning, the Alter Rebbe asked someone to remark to Kuzma, the Gentile handyman, that it would be impossible to eat in the sukkah as long as the snow was piled on top. He cleared the snow away, and the Rebbe went out to the sukkah to recite Kiddush and eat the festive meal of Shabbos and Yom Tov there. Okay, that's the story. Now, there's a number of things to remark in this story. Number one, that it was Shmini Atzeres, so we're strict to eat in the sukkah even in Shmini Atzeres. Number two, that even though it was freezing cold, they didn't use that as a heter to eat outside of the sukkah. Number three, that it seems that, he was saying that it was forbidden to eat in the sukkah with the snow on top, which is a machlokas apaskim. It's machlokas, again, it's not so common in America that there should be snow on sukkahs, and certainly not a lot of snow, but in places where you could have a tefach, let's say, a couple of inches of snow on top of the sukkah, then there's a machlokas whether that disqualifies the sukkah, because we find in various mishnayos and brises that snow is not really considered a unit. It's considered each grain of snow is considered a separate unit. Long story short, from here it seems that the Alter Rebbe at least was machmir, like the opinion that it is that you can't eat in the sukkah with the snow on top. Now the question is the number of questions. First of all, why did he have to? So why was he telling the goy to remove the snow? Why couldn't he remove it himself? Or why couldn't the Yidden remove it? Why? I mean, and then he says it was Friday night. What if Shmini Atzeres would have been during the week? What's the difference? So this is a very relevant story because it touches upon the whole snow on Shabbos. The reason why it's irrelevant is because there's so many variables that we can't really determine anything conclusive, because it could be that the reason he asked, he says he asked the guy, he didn't ask him directly. They asked him in a way of, they didn't tell him, please remove the snow. They said, we have to eat in the sukkah, and they can't eat in the sukkah with the snow. Now, what about Shabbos? Like, did they say that way because it was Shabbos, and maybe the issue was because the place where he had to remove the snow to was outside of that domain, or is that irrelevant? And it just happened to be that it was Shabbos, but the same would have happened if it wasn't a Tuesday. Again, like we said before, it's pretty much explicit that snow is not muktzah, so it's unlikely that the issue was a muktzah.
Is it possible that it's basically making the sukkah functioning?
Oh, so that's another question. Is the fact that it's making the sukkah functional, so that some sort of baina or makibapatish or something, that would be the reason why it was forbidden for them to do. Again, it could be they could have done it themselves and they just asked the guy because they asked the handyman. But then why would they have sent it in as an illusion and not as not an illusion, an allusion? Why didn't they ask him directly? So anyway, this story has been chewed over many times. Many people have written about it, but the bottom line is it becomes very difficult to draw any sort of conclusive conclusions from this story, and so it's very relevant but very irrelevant. Be that as it may, the psak remains as far as clearing your own sidewalk, like we discussed, and in Yetz Hashem next week we'll discuss the other issues pertaining to clearing snow. Thank you all for joining. Bill, if you would come in person, you would see somebody very special. Say hi to your son-in-law.
Maybe a couple of weeks I'll be there.
Okay, we're looking forward.
Take care.
All right, bye.